A presidential election year now literally upon us, increased scrutiny of election integrity efforts is as paramount as it's ever been. I mean, we've seen corruption infiltrate so many institutions, and all this really just demonstrates why vigilant oversight of state election processes remains extremely important for us to monitor throughout this year. A recent Florida bill strengthened requirements for maintaining lists of voters. Good step forward. Some lawmakers in my own state of Georgia plan to consider several options to make those elections more transparent and trustworthy. So we're seeing some states try to make some efforts, but how can we encourage other state legislators to consider similar approaches? Well, joining me now to discuss this is Jason Snead. He's the executive director of Honest Elections. Jason, welcome to Washington Watch. Great to have you.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, listen, election integrity issues, as we all know, it's going to continue to dominate so many discussions this year. But before we go into the big picture, tell us about some of these recent stories that we've seen on the topic, such as what I just referenced coming out of Florida.
Well, we've seen some enormous strides that states across the country have made in the last 3 years, making it easier to vote and harder to cheat by, for instance, making it easier to clean up voter rolls, which is an important foundational step to ensuring that you have election integrity. So we saw articles just this week that Florida has actually removed a significant number of outdated registrations pursuant to a new law that they just adopted to make that process easier. And we've seen other headlines as well. For instance, Florida also created a unit to allow it to investigate potential election malfeasance. And that's something which more states need to be doing, because all too often potential election crimes go uninvestigated and unprosecuted. And that allows a cancer to metastasize in our democratic process when people know that they can commit election fraud and get away with it because no one's going to check to see what actually happened after the fact.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some other states that are following suit. Georgia, for example, my home state. Fill us in on what type of things they're looking at.
Well, Georgia is an important state to consider because they have endured 3 years of endless attacks from the left. Everything that they have tried to do since the 2020 election to improve elections in the state of Georgia has been attacked as Jim Crow 2.0, even though the state has now held historically high turnout elections in 2022 and completely disproved that myth. But nevertheless, Georgia has also shown us how important it is to make iterative changes every single year to the election system. Not changes for the sake of change, but changes because every time you hold an election, you learn something that hasn't gone correct and you need to fix it, or another state tries something and you want to emulate their success in your own state. Elections are constantly changing because we're constantly looking for improvements, and Georgia has shown the way. This year, Georgia is considering some additional changes to their election law that would strengthen and improve the voting process for all voters, and that includes potentially even changes to the absentee system. This is something I think more states need to look closely at. It's important to protect vulnerable mail votes and ensure that if you are choosing to cast a ballot by mail, that you can ensure that that ballot is actually going to be properly counted and that it isn't going to be tampered with or interfered with by vote trafficking or other operations. So I think that we need to have more states doing what Georgia has already done, improving and securing that process, and then looking for ways to generally make sure that we have elections that flow smoothly for all voters.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have a book coming out, supposedly, hopefully at the end of next month, on election integrity, and that is one of the issues that I deal with that is so important. This whole issue of mail-in votes is just open season for problems if you don't get it right. How important, Jason, is it for other state legislators to be examining similar efforts? So we go across the nation. How important is this nationwide?
No, I think that this is easily a top 5 issue. And I say that because even though each one of us has issues that aren't directly related to elections at first blush that we may be very passionate about, we may think that abortion is the signature issue that we're voting on. We may think it's national security. We may think it's the China problem or ESG. But if we don't get elections right, none of those other issues matter. That's something that the left, frankly, understands. They understand that if they can change the rules and change the process, they can change the results of the elections. And that's why they're they're trying everything that they can to rewrite our election rules. If they can't get it done in legislatures, they run to courts and they get judges, often activist judges, to issue rulings that essentially rewrite election laws. They're trying to do that in Georgia, in Florida, in key battleground states right now. They're trying to influence elections with the reemergence of Zuck bucks. This is a problem in 2020 with private money that was flowing into election offices and was being used for what looks like partisan get out the vote efforts from within government. Now they've got a new program, the U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence, which is active in a number of states, including states like Georgia that have banned this problem. And we see other attempts to completely change the way that we conduct elections with ranked choice voting. Potentially 10 states will have the opportunity to vote on a constitutional amendment being pushed from the left to fundamentally alter elections with this new system called ranked choice voting. So it is essential that state lawmakers across the country constantly be mindful of their election laws, constantly be looking for ways to improve it. The left isn't stopping, and so conservatives who believe in election integrity cannot either.
All right, last question. Let's kind of land the plane on this, because obviously at the end of the day, what we want is for voters to have faith that their vote will count. So what can our viewers and our listeners do in their home states to help push for voter integrity efforts?
Well, I think that the most important thing you can do is educate yourself on the problems and the solutions. And in fact, my organization, the Honest Elections Project, has an entire report dedicated to what you need to do in order to make sure that you have elections that you can have confidence in. I also commend to folks the Heritage Foundation's Election Integrity Scorecard, which also lays out the key principles that every state needs to have in order to have elections that you can trust. And I encourage you to talk to your neighbors, talk to your fellow members of your communities, and talk to your lawmakers as well, and make sure that they understand that this is an urgent issue, that this is an important issue. We have to get elections right, and we have to keep our eye on the ball. It's a lot easier to keep a reputation of trust and honesty than to regain it if you lose it. And right now, unfortunately, trust in our democratic process is fragile. So we should always be doing everything that we can to make it easier to vote, but also harder to cheat.
Jason Snead from Honest Elections, thank you so much for joining us on Washington Watch. Great input.